What the hell was he thinking? They just shrugged and said, oh, it's just inflation.
Misrepresenting the inflation crisis?
Just inflation. Imagine. It's just inflation. Well, imagine. It's just inflation. We'll to have people's backs.
Never mind the good and the bad. Let's look at the Machiavellian. And under that scenario, Trudeau and the PMO office or whoever's running things, he's been in power a long time, and there's been a lot of ethics violations, almost too many to count. Watch this scene. How did they keep doing it? Staying in power.
Into the Prime Minister's
with a new election on the horizon. There's talk about it.
2 hours with us,
in the fall.
Important, relevant details on how she came to find the Prime Minister guilty of 4 violations of the Conflict of Interest Act. Findings of the Trudeau Report number 1 detailed unacceptable ethical lapses by the Prime Minister. But the Trudeau Report number 2, the scathing report released just last week by the current Ethics Commissioner, Mario Dion, details many more serious violations of the Conflict of Interest Act, up to and including, by any reasonable measure, attempted obstruction of justice. Or, as Commissioner Dion concludes, actions, quote, contrary to the constitutional principles of prosecutorial independence and the rule of law, close quote. Which is why, colleagues, my colleague, Mr. Gourd, and I wrote the following letter to the chair of our committee, Mr. Zimmer. And that letter said, and I'll read it into the record, yesterday the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner released the Trudeau 2 report. The report found the Prime Minister directly and through his senior officials used various means to exert influence over Ms. Wilson-Raybould. The authority of the Prime Minister and his office was used to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately attempt to discredit the decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the authority of Ms. Wilson-Raybould as the Crown's Chief Law Officer. This is incredibly concerning. These findings show that Justin Trudeau used the power of his office to reward his friends and to punish his critics.
They shrugged and said, oh, it's just inflation. It's just inflation. Imagine.
It's just inflation.
Well, imagine. It's just
to ensure that every parliamentarian meets the highest ethical code. And when you're the Prime Minister of this country, you're expected to meet the highest ethical code. So we have the Commissioner ready to speak, to respond to the report, as his normal function is to come to our committee and present that report. We need to hear from Mr. Dion, because to have the Prime Minister of the country to be found guilty of breaking the law, to aid very, very powerful people in writing a piece of legislation that existed only for that company. It was written for one purpose, to get them a get out of jail card. And then to have a campaign involving so many key people in the Liberal government to put pressure on the Attorney General and the independent prosecutor is not acceptable. Either we have the rule of law in this country or we don't. And that's what the fundamental question is. So for the Prime Minister to invoke the Mark Zuckerberg defense, which is, hey, thanks a lot for finding me guilty, I'm just going to blow you off. Mark Zuckerberg may get away with that because he lives in another jurisdiction and he's a gazillionaire. But Justin Trudeau cannot blow off the Ethics Commissioner of Canada. If he wants to do that, then he needs to come back and bring a law in that says he's no longer bound by any laws. But right now he's bound by the Conflict of Interest Act, and he's been found guilty. We see that there's a pattern of interference by his office and the Privy Council that interrupted 9 potential witnesses to give testimony. We need to know who those 9 witnesses were. We need to know how extent was the interference and the obstruction in the work of the Ethics Commission.
It's just inflation. It's just inflation. We'll imagine. It's just inflation. We'll to have people's backs.
Where we find ourselves in uncharted territory is this. The Conflict of Interest Act does not allow for the Ethics Commissioner's report to be changed. No committee of Parliament, no vote in the House of Commons can change the contents or the decision of the Ethics Commissioner. The report is what it is and stands as it is. Yet the Prime Minister is now trying to say that the report is wrong. But good news for him is if he chooses to, in fact, go ahead and appeal the ruling of the ethics commissioner, he has the ability to do so. And he can do that by launching a judicial review at the Federal Court of Appeal. That is the appropriate venue for the Prime Minister to challenge the ethics commissioner, not in the court of public opinion, which is he's seeking to do right now.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up, Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Chairman, you've told us that the ethics commissioner is standing by, ready to testify about his guilty verdict that he rendered against the Prime Minister last week. Now, the Prime Minister's MPs across the way will decide whether, after silencing Jody Wilson-Raybould, they will silence the ethics commissioner as well. Whether they will vote to ban the ethics commissioner from appearing at the ethics committee. And if so, what that says about the ethics of this government. It's important to recap why we're here. SNC-Lavalin is accused of over $100 million of fraud and bribery, accused of stealing over $100 million from among the poorest people in the world. Instead of going to trial, the company convinced the Prime Minister to change the criminal code, allowing alleged corporate criminals to get off of a trial by signing a deal to apologize and promise never to do it again. The Prime Minister passed that in an omnibus bill and then demanded his Attorney General extend such a deal against the earlier decision of the top prosecutor. She refused, so he fired her. She spoke out, so he kicked her out and shut down the numerous parliamentary inquiries into the matter. Since then, he has told us, wait for the ethics commissioner to issue his verdict. And so we all waited, assuming that when that verdict came, we'd all be able to hear about it right here in the Ethics Committee. Here today, we will decide if, in fact, that will happen. We know that there's a lot more to this story. The Ethics Commissioner has not been able to tell. At least 9 witnesses were prevented by the Trudeau government from telling their full story because of a government-imposed gag order under the guise of cabinet confidentiality. There are many mysteries that we need to unravel in this matter, and only by hearing witnesses can we do so. One of them is this famous 9,000 jobs claim. You know, most of SNC-Lavalin's jobs in this country are for construction work done in this country. They're going to be building a north-south transit project here in Ottawa. Well, they can't build that in Hong Kong or in Munich and then drop it out of a helicopter on the nation's capital. That work will have to be done here. The headquarters must stay in Montreal until the year 2024, according to a loan agreement with the Quebec pension plan. The CEO of the company said that the company is not moving anywhere, and we know that leaving Canada would not exempt the company from prosecution or conviction. So we've tried to ask the government where this claim about jobs has come from. In fact, Ms. May asked some of the best questions on this matter. She asked Mr. Wernick, in the public interest then, Mr. Wernick, in preparing advice to Cabinet, what work did you do to assess the threat of jobs? Did you look at the commitments made to the government of Quebec not to move the headquarters, as mentioned? Did you look at the current financial status of SNC-Lavalin? Did you, in fact, have an independent assessment of whether there would be any impact on jobs from a decision to proceed to the Director of Public Prosecutions had decided to proceed? Response, no, because the file was entirely in the carriage of the then Minister of Justice. Apparently, the Justice Department now does jobs assessments. Gerald Butts had a different story when Ms. May asked the same question. She asked, is there any evidence that jobs were actually going to be at stake by letting this go through the courts and letting the independent Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General do their jobs? Gerald Butts, I can't recall anything specific. He also said, my understanding from the department, that the jobs claim was his understanding from the Department of Finance briefings. But I have to say it's been a long time. So now we're claiming that the Department of Finance has proof of this 9,000 jobs claim. So let's turn over to the finance minister. Well, in the Ethics Commissioner's report, I quote, when asked if he, Morneau, or his office had undertaken a study or analysis of the economic impacts of the Director of Public Prosecution's decision, Morneau testified that none had been conducted. And then a reporter on March 7th asked the Prime Minister the following question. Both Mr. Wernick and Mr. Butts testified they had no direct evidence that 9,000 potential of that 9,000 potential job loss. Did you have any evidence of 9,000 jobs being lost? Response, we had heard representations from various sources, including the company itself, that this was an issue of deep concern to them and that it could potentially have consequences as dire as the company having to leave Canada altogether. Now, you notice he didn't provide any evidence, but he did claim that the company might leave the country altogether. Well, let's turn to the Ethics Commissioner's report on that. Top Trudeau advisor, Mr. Bouchard, notes from the same October 23rd, 2018 meeting with senior officials of the Privy Council office show that they also discussed SNC's Board of Directors' potential plan to move the corporate headquarters, but the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec would not let that happen. In other words, Mr. Trudeau's office knew in October, months before he made the claim that the headquarters would leave, that that eventuality was impossible. So given that this was not about jobs, the most important question I want to ask is what motivated this? What on God's green earth would compel a prime minister to pass a law at the request of one company, exempting corporate criminals from prosecution, put pressure on his attorney general to overturn his top prosecutor, and then fire her when she refused to do so, given that it was not about jobs? We know that SNC-Lavalin gave $100,000 of illegal donations to the Liberal Party. We know they swarmed Parliament Hill and the PMO with lobbyists. There was a revolving door between this government and SNC-Lavalin. We need to know the real motive for helping protect.
Don't forget to like, dislike, subscribe, and comment. Safe Space Cafe. And always, have a good day.